go.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our first In the Chair session for the Harrow Circle. I'm Frances, and in another life I used to interview people usually about crazy government policies. Happily, I'm no longer trying to untangle the waffle wall. Instead, I'm interviewing two fascinating circle members who've spent much of their lives in places I've always had a vague fear of: aircraft. Pat spent his work life in the aviation industry, while Andrew joined the RAF and then moved on. Like most of us, both are now retired, and we'll be talking to Pat first. Pat started his career in the 60s with an apprenticeship on helicopters and light aircraft before joining an airline as a ground engineer, progressing to a flight engineer and eventually training as a pilot. Most of his working life was with British Airways, but during times of recession and during the Gulf War, he tells me he was loaned to other airlines and then spending time in Africa, the Middle East and the Far East. Pat also worked as a flying instructor at Denham Airport. He retired from all his flying duties in 2008. So Pat, how did you get started in your career?
Yeah, good evening, Frances, and good evening to everybody. And it's quite a coincidence that we have so many people here tonight from Northampton, because they would probably recognize some of the places, because that's where I actually started off. And I started off in the 60s by doing an apprenticeship, and I actually attended Northampton College of Technology on a day release, which was part of apprenticeships in those days. And the way I got into it really is like a lot of these businesses, it's through connections that starts an interest going. And it was through my brother-in-law that actually was involved in helicopters in the very early days. And the helicopters that we were involved in, probably a lot of people would recognize from the MASH series, the little Bell helicopters. And the ones we were involved with were used for crop spraying, which is now is not allowed anymore, but other than in some parts of the world, and they still use them. The same helicopters are still in use now, what, over 50 years later. But that's basically how I started off, and then progressed on from there to in gradual steps up until I eventually joined an airline. And again, the reason I joined the airline was because one of the instructors where I did my apprenticeship was at one time a trainer in British Airways, and he directed me, if you like, how to progress on.
What did being a flight engineer involved, really? I really don't know.
Yeah, because I then got into with the airlines, which then I got experience working on jet engines, more complex airplanes, what we call pressurized airplanes. And that then put me in line to become a flight engineer. And what they wanted was somebody obviously with a lot of technical knowledge of all the systems, because a lot of the systems are designed with well, they've obviously got to be safe, but they do crop up with a lot of problems, and it's how all that's managed during the flight, how it can be, you can actually depart a flight with some problems with the system, but you get guidance on that. So it's very important. In those days, they didn't have as much technology like they have now. So they obviously needed, there's a lot of technology now tells the people exactly what to do. But in those days, we didn't have that. It was a case of going through books and finding what procedures you would follow if some part of the system wasn't working. And then eventually it became, you were a very integrated part of the crew. So everybody in the cockpit was monitoring the same things and monitoring each other. Sorry, just you all work together. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you told me that you eventually became a pilot. So did you have some kind of role models that you saw pilots in operation and thought, that's something for me?
Yes, yeah. Well, because I was involved with the light aviation side and I started into flying, and a lot of the flying instructors in those days would have been still ex-wartime. It shows my age now, but they're getting towards the end of their flying, and they were fantastic people, passing on their knowledge, and you couldn't but admire them. And you know how sort of they passed that knowledge on to me, and the job I was doing is like a lot of things. It looked like eventually it would be phased out with the computer age, and as it turned out, I more or less completed my career as a flight engineer before I had to then move on to as a pilot. Plus it's a sort of business that you're progressing in all the time. So just to make it for security.
So was being a pilot very different from being, I suppose, just a member of the crew?
Yes. You'd spent a lot of time doing that, and we were really being. I think, as I mentioned to you, if you showed any interest in that flying side, when we would be doing simulator sessions, and at the end of the session, if there was time available, a lot of the training captains would give you flying time on the simulator to keep your interest in going. And we're also, because you had to monitor the navigation, where the airplane's going, we had our own little navigation set, which we were told was ours. So the crew had to ask you for permission. You know, it was just to show that, so you could set up the navigation on that to monitor the others, what they were doing. So towards the end, we had a lot of insight, obviously, into the flying side. You know, so and a lot of the courses, what they brought in the end, cockpit resource management and all this. So we had already done all that.
What was your first flight like then? Can you remember?
The first flight I did was on the 707, but it's, to be honest, it's difficult to recall back now. One of the things they did was, and I would assume they still do it, if there's a case that one of the pilots is his first flight, then obviously that would be highlighted. So the rest of the crew would be aware of that, and obviously just, and it was quite an accepted thing. People used to say, you know, I'm new, I haven't been on the airplane very long, just can you keep an eye on me? Okay. And no, it's a sort of relief, if you know to get it over with, and
You were a commercial pilot. I mentioned in my intro that you traveled around the world and you'd been a pilot.
Yeah, a lot of the traveling I did was like in Africa. I was loaned out to Zambia Airways. But that was as a flight engineer. That was towards the end of yes, the beginning of the 80s. And then I was loaned to KLM, to the Dutch airline. That was during the Gulf War. And then when I actually retired, because when I was the retirement age, the union age was 55. So I carried on flying then with an agency.
Okay. Which part of your career gave you the most satisfaction, do you think?
Probably it's difficult to. It's more that we were operating in a sort of an atmosphere of you had to be at a high standard all the time, and you were checked a lot, but you were given a lot of training as well and a lot of refreshers. So you didn't really have the time to get, what should I say, not bored, but there was always something. Your medical check was coming up, your simulator check was coming up, your refresher training was coming up, your cabin training. We had to do cabin training as well, which we weren't involved with a lot, and we had to do that with cabin crew, and they were obviously very experienced in that. You know how life rafts worked, and it just shows how. I think you were in the medical field. We used to carry a medical kit, which is quite. I think it could only be opened by a doctor, but they expected us to know what was in it and what it was used for. But then somebody came up with an idea to put a leaflet on it and write on there what was on it.
That's quite reassuring.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, I know you were retired quite a long time ago, but from where a lot of us sit, most of the flight deck are still white and male. Do you think that's changing, or do you not?
Yeah, yes, and I saw your question on that. I would have thought, I would have thought that's changed. No, certainly, as I was leaving, there were a lot of female coming in, but on the colour side of it, yeah, I'm surprised at that, and I would have thought there's more. But I'll just tell you a quick story about that. Once, when I was doing a flight. That would have been probably in the early 90s, and we were going to Bombay on the 747, and the captain was actually a friend of mine, a lady, Jan McCabe. I knew Jan from Denham, and Jan was like an aviation. She came from an aviation family, but when she did her PA, after we started off, some of the passengers were very surprised. And one of the cabin crew came up and said, well, there's a passenger in business class, and he was from India, and he would like to come up to talk to her. And I think he was very surprised. But he came up, and he was a very nice guy. He just could not believe that we had a lady captain. You know, he just wanted to see it for himself. But now I see videos of airlines in the Middle East and all over India with an all-female crew. And I've even seen a video of American Air Force with a complete female crew. So, but I would have thought that it's certainly on the female side. Yes, I think it's changed a lot, but maybe not so much on the colour side. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. What And another slightly off-wing question, what difference do you think the pandemic will make to the airline industry? Have you had to think about it at all? Or?
Yeah, well, the only thing I could say about that is obviously there's no point in me giving an opinion on it because I would just be guessing on that. But what I would say is I did read something about it recently, and what they were saying, and in actual fact, I only read it about a week ago, and one of the things they've said has actually come about, and that's what they said was that airlines in South America are in big trouble. Now, that may be because they were on borderline as it was. And I see that just the other day that a big airline in Argentina has gone out of business. So they think a lot of them, what they mentioned was South America, Africa will have a lot of problems. South African Airways are already in big trouble before this. And this is not my opinion, this is just what I read. And they think that a lot of the European airlines may go back to being nationalized. And if then going back to on my opinion side of it, I would see it means higher fares. That's what I would say, that there'll be less. Because if you see, I can remember going back to the 70s with the 747 coming in, and that brought in cheap flights, the wide-bodied airplanes. And if you look now, these are the airplanes they've got rid of. The 747s have gone, and they think, or it looks like the big Airbus will go as well. The 4-engine airplanes will go. Which
very interesting. Well, Pat, I'm afraid Hugh's messaged me to say that we need to draw to a close. And thanks ever so much for the conversation.
Hugh is bored, is he?
No, the stopwatch says 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And we'll
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done, Pat.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed.